The scent of burning peat and autumn rain clung to everything in the Scottish Highlands, to the ancient stone walls of Blackmore Castle, to the heavy tapestries depicting centuries of wolf hunts, to Nancy's auburn braids as she pressed her small face against the leaded glass window, mesmerized by the massive wolves prowling the moonlit courtyard below. I could smell it even on my own work-worn hands, no matter how hard I scrubbed in the servants' cold water basin. The unmistakable mark of a place where we didn't belong. "Mama, why do their eyes shine like fire?" Nancy whispered, her breath fogging the ancient glass. She was only 7, with hair the color of autumn leaves and curiosity too dangerous for our precarious position. My curiosity, people used to say back in Yorkshire, though I wished she'd inherited her father's quiet caution instead. "Because they're different from us, sweetheart," I murmured, gently pulling her back from the window. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted her patched gray dress, smoothing fabric worn thin from years of hard living. "We need to return to the kitchens. Mrs. Henderson will have our hides if we're caught wandering." But Nancy had already spotted something else. A heavy oak door left slightly ajar at the corridor's end, golden lamplight spilling across cold flagstones. Before I could stop her, she'd slipped from my grasp and darted toward it with the fearless curiosity that constantly terrified me. "Nancy, no," I hissed, my voice barely above a whisper. We were servants here, human servants in a fortress full of werewolves who could tear us apart without consequence. For months we'd survived in these Highland mountains, accepting whatever menial work kept us fed after fleeing England. For months of keeping invisible, our voices soft, our existence as small as humanly possible. My mother's words echoed in my mind, the last thing Rose had told me before succumbing to fever. "Where shadows fall, light a candle. Where hate festers, plant kindness. The mightiest fortress crumbles not to battering rams, but to gentle hands that refuse to become fists." She'd been a midwife in a small Yorkshire village, beloved by all who knew her. I'd inherited her fair complexion and supposedly her gift for healing, though right now, I felt particularly ungifted at everything except barely surviving. The silver pendant at my throat, my mother's pendant, intricately carved with a delicate rose bloom, felt heavy as I hurried after Nancy. It was all I had left of the life before. Before my husband died defending our village from raiders, before we became rootless and vulnerable, before I learned that humans without protection were invisible at best, expendable at worst, in this world of ancient bloodlines and supernatural power. Nancy had already disappeared through the doorway by the time I reached it, my worn shoes silent on the cold stone. The room beyond stole my breath, a portrait gallery stretching into shadows, dozens of gilt-framed paintings lining walls the color of midnight. Centuries of faces stared down with wolf-gold eyes and expressions that spoke of power I'd never understand. But Nancy stood frozen before one portrait in particular, small and impossibly still in a way that sent ice through my veins. "Mama," she whispered, and the single word carried something I'd never heard in her voice before. Fear. "Mama, why do you have a picture here?" I moved to her side, and the world tilted sideways. The woman in the portrait wore a gown of deep crimson silk, her fair hair arranged in elaborate braids, her expression serene and regal. But it was her face, my face, staring back at me with unsettling precision. And at her throat, catching lamplight like a small star, hung the exact silver rose pendant that now rested against my work-worn skin. "What in God's name?" I breathed, reaching instinctively for Nancy. "Sarah?" The voice behind us was rough, commanding, vibrating with something that made my bones remember they were prey. "What are you doing in my private?" The Alpha King stood in the doorway, massive frame filling the space, dark hair pulled back to reveal a face carved from Highland granite. But whatever reprimand he'd been preparing died on his lips as his gaze found the portrait, then swung to me with an impact like physical violence. The color drained from his face. His hands gripped the doorframe, as though the floor had become unstable beneath him. "Rose," he rasped, the word breaking like something fragile and irreparable. "By all the gods, Rose. My name is Sarah." My voice came out steadier than I felt, one arm wrapped protectively around Nancy. "Sarah Mitchell. I don't know who. That's not your mother's portrait." He moved forward with predatory grace despite the visible tremor in his hands, never breaking eye contact with me. "That's my mate, my Luna. Rose Whitmore, who vanished from this castle 26 years ago." His voice dropped to something raw and devastating. 3 months pregnant with my heir. The mathematics crashed through me with brutal simplicity. 26 years. I was 26 years old, born in a Yorkshire cottage my mother claimed we'd always lived in, though I had no memories before age 3. Born to a woman who'd been a midwife, a healer, beloved by a village whose name I suddenly couldn't recall with any certainty. No. The denial was automatic, desperate. My mother was Rose Mitchell. She was a widow, she raised me alone, But the pendant at my throat felt suddenly like a brand, burning with accusation. Mama. Nancy's voice cut through my spiraling panic, high and strange. When I looked down, her eyes had changed, no longer the warm brown I'd kissed goodnight every evening of her life, but blazing gold, luminous and utterly inhuman in her small face. Mama, the dangerous ones are coming for us. I can smell them. They smell like rot underneath. The Alpha King's expression transformed from shock to lethal focus in a heartbeat. Get them to the Rose Tower, he barked at someone in the hallway I couldn't see. Now. Full guard. No one gets close. But I was already moving, pulling Nancy against me as I stumbled backward toward the door, my daughter's golden eyes fading back to brown as tears began streaming down her face. She was 7 years old and terrified, and something impossible was happening to her. Something I had no words to explain because my entire existence had just been revealed as a carefully constructed fiction. Don't touch us, I managed, my mother's voice echoing in my head with new and terrible significance. Plant kindness where hate festers. Had she been talking about this place? These wolves? We're leaving. You're my daughter. The Alpha King's words stopped me at the threshold, absolute and immovable as the stone walls surrounding us. And that child, my gods, that child is my granddaughter. You're not going anywhere, Sarah. Not anymore. Not ever again. We made it back to the servants' quarters somehow, Nancy's hand clutched in mine, both of us shaking like autumn leaves in a Highland gale. I locked the door with trembling fingers, as if a simple lock could protect us from werewolves, from Alpha Kings, from the impossible truth that my mother had lied about everything. Who was Rose Whitmore? Who was I? And what had my mother been running from that was terrifying enough to abandon a mate, a kingdom, a life of silk gowns and portraits in golden frames? The silver pendant felt heavy as a millstone against my chest, its delicate rose bloom suddenly sinister in the candlelight. All I had left of the life before, I'd thought. But perhaps it had never been my life at all. Perhaps I'd been living in someone else's desperate escape, inheriting a fear I didn't understand, running from shadows I couldn't name. Nancy curled against me on our narrow servant's bed, her eyes brown again, but her small body still trembling. Mama, I could see things, she whispered against my shoulder. Bad things in some people's hearts. Darkness that wants to hurt us. I held her tighter, my own heart fracturing beneath the weight of too many impossible revelations. My daughter had wolf abilities. I might be a princess. My mother had been a queen who'd fled in terror. And somewhere in this castle, the dangerous ones Nancy had sensed were already plotting our destruction. The summons came at midnight, a knock so soft I almost mistook it for wind against shutters. A female guard with kind eyes and a scar across her jaw murmured that the Alpha King requested my presence in his private study. Not a command, she emphasized. An invitation, as if I had any real choice in the matter. Robert's tower study smelled of old leather and burning candles, papers scattered across a massive oak desk like evidence of a man who'd stopped sleeping. He looked up when I entered, and the raw devastation in his face made him seem suddenly, startlingly human despite the supernatural power radiating from every line of his body. I found her letters. His voice was gravel and broken glass. Hidden in the wall behind that portrait, sealed with her own blood to preserve them. He gestured to yellowed pages spread before him, Rose's elegant handwriting visible even from where I stood frozen in the doorway. She documented everything. Lord Blackwell, Lady Thornfield, Councillor Morrison, they planned to poison her. Called her human blood a contamination. Said any heir of hers would be an abomination that would weaken the pack's purity. My hand found the pendant at my throat instinctively, the silver suddenly burning against my skin. She knew for weeks, Robert continued, each word scraped raw. Gathered evidence, copied conversations she'd overheard. And she never told me. His fist came down on the desk with enough force to crack the wood. If she'd trusted me, if she'd just told me the truth, I would have destroyed anyone who threatened her. I would have razed the entire council to ash and rebuilt from nothing. She was 3 months pregnant and terrified. I heard myself say, defending a mother I'd thought I knew but apparently never had. Surrounded by people who wanted her dead. Who wanted me. The word caught in my throat. Me. Not some abstract heir. Me, unborn and already condemned. She didn't trust me to protect her. The admission seemed to physically pain him, shoulders bowing under the weight. My mate, the other half of my soul. She looked at me and saw someone who would fail her. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 26 years of grief and missed chances and parallel lives that should have been won. And now Nancy. Robert's gaze found mine, intense and searching. Your daughter, our family, shows abilities at 7 years old that most wolves don't manifest until puberty. Enhanced senses, the ability to perceive intent. If the same council members who wanted Rose dead learn that a child with human bloodline carries such power. He didn't need to finish. The threat was obvious. They'll try again, I whispered. They'll come for her just like they came for Rose. Yes. No cushioning the blow, no false comfort. Just brutal honesty. Which is why I intend to publicly claim you both. Tomorrow, before the entire pack assembly. Acknowledge you as my daughter, Nancy as my heir's child, both under my direct protection. My blood turned to ice. That's painting targets on our backs. The targets are already there, Sarah. He moved around the desk, and I forced myself not to retreat from his approach. The only question is whether you face them visible and protected, or hidden and vulnerable like Rose was. Like Rose was. The comparison hit like a physical blow. My mother had chosen to run, to hide, to trust no one. She'd survived, yes, but at what cost? A lifetime looking over her shoulder, never belonging anywhere, teaching me that safety meant invisibility. And in the end, she died alone in a cottage far from anything she'd once called home, her secrets buried so deep even her daughter hadn't known they existed. If I say yes, I force the words past the terror lodging in my throat. I'm choosing differently than she did. I'm trusting you to protect us when she couldn't. I failed her once. Robert's voice was low, absolute. I will not fail you. Or Nancy. Not while I draw breath. His hand moved toward mine, then stopped, waiting. Asking. But the choice has to be yours. I won't force this. Your mother ran because she felt she had no choice. I'm giving you one. Stand beside him and fight, visible and vulnerable, trusting in protection my mother had deemed impossible. Or take Nancy and disappear into the world the way Rose had, running from shadows until running became our entire existence. My mother's pendant felt heavy against my heart, a reminder of her choices, her fears, her desperate solitary flight. But Nancy deserved more than that. Deserved better than learning that safety meant becoming invisible, that trust was impossible, that love meant always preparing to run. Tomorrow, I whispered, and watched something like hope break across the Alpha King's devastated face. We stand before the pack tomorrow. My hand found his, and I chose trust where my mother had chosen fear, visibility where she'd chosen hiding, faith where she'd chosen flight. The decision terrified me more than anything in my life. But perhaps that was what courage actually meant, doing the terrifying thing anyway, for love of a daughter who deserved to stop running. Nancy's hands wouldn't stop trembling as the maid fastened the deep green velvet gown Robert had sent to our chambers. Am I really a princess, Mama? She whispered, her reflection in the mirror showing a child too young to carry the weight pressing down on both our shoulders. I don't know what we are yet, sweetheart. I smoothed her auburn braids, fighting my own terror. But we're about to find out together. The great hall stretched before us like the throat of some ancient beast, hundreds of wolves packed shoulder to shoulder beneath vaulted stone ceilings. Their eyes tracked our entrance with predatory precision, golden, amber, silver, illuminated by massive iron chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across faces both curious and hostile. Robert stood at the hall's far end in full ceremonial regalia, dark leather and silver catching torchlight, looking every inch the Alpha King who'd ruled these territories for 3 decades. When his gaze found mine across that sea of supernatural power, something fierce and protective flared in his expression. I present Sarah Mitchell, his voice carried to every corner with commanding authority, daughter of Rose Whitmore, my blood and my heir, and her daughter Nancy, granddaughter of my line, both under my direct and absolute protection. The hall erupted. Lord Blackwell rose from the council's elevated seats, his jowled face mottled with rage. You expect us to accept a human servant's claim? Where's your proof beyond a passing resemblance? I consent the alpha blood. A massive gray-haired warrior stepped forward from the crowd, scarred hands raised in traditional deference. It's unmistakable in both of them. The child especially, she carries power. As can I, another voice called. Then another. Wolves throughout the assembly moving forward, some nodding with certainty, others murmuring agreement that rippled through the gathered pack like wine through highland grass. But Nancy had gone rigid beside me, her small hand gripping mine with bruising force. Her eyes, brown one moment, flaring golden the next, fixed on the 3 council members still seated with expressions of barely concealed fury. "Mama," she said, her child's voice carrying in the sudden quiet with eerie clarity. "That one smells rotten." Her finger pointed directly at Lady Thornfield. "Like meat left in summer sun. And him. Counselor Morrison. And him too." Lord Blackwell's face drained of color. The hall fell into stunned silence. "My granddaughter," Robert's voice was soft, deadly, "has inherited her great-grandmother's gift. The ability to sense intent, to perceive the darkness in hearts that mean us harm." His gaze swept to the 3 council members Nancy had identified. The same council members documented in Rose's letters as conspirators in her attempted assassination 26 years ago. Guards moved forward with practiced efficiency. Lord Blackwell stood, his voice shaking with impotent rage. "You cannot prove." "Escort them out," Robert commanded. "Summon the territorial magistrate. We'll have a formal trial with proper evidence." His eyes never left the 3 wolves being surrounded by armed guards. But everyone in this hall just witnessed a 7-year-old child identify threats she's never met, using abilities that manifest only in the most powerful bloodlines. Lady Thornfield's perfect composure cracked as she was led toward the doors, her venomous gaze promising retribution. They knew. All 3 knew they'd been exposed by a child's innocent observation, their decades-old conspiracy unraveling, because Nancy could smell the rot beneath their civilized masks. The remaining pack members broke into chaos, some cheering, others arguing, the hall vibrating with supernatural energy and political upheaval. But Robert crossed to us, his massive frame blocking us from the crowd's volatile attention. "The point of no return is behind us now," he said quietly, one hand coming to rest on Nancy's trembling shoulder. "They know who you are. They know what Nancy can do. Every wolf loyal to those council members will see you as threats to their power structure." I looked down at my daughter, golden eyes fading back to brown, tears tracking down her pale cheeks. She'd just identified attempted murderers before hundreds of witnesses. She was 7 years old and had become a weapon in a political war she didn't understand. "We're visible now," I whispered, the words Rose had spent her life fleeing. Visible meant vulnerable. Visible meant painted targets. "Visible means protected," Robert countered, his voice absolute. "Every wolf who stepped forward to vouch for your bloodline just declared their allegiance. You're not alone anymore, Sarah. Neither of you. That's the difference between your story and your mother's." The crowd parted as he led us through the great hall, wolves bowing in respect or watching with calculating interest. Some faces held welcome, others suspicion, still others naked hostility barely restrained by their alpha's presence. We'd crossed the threshold, stepped into the light, claimed our place in a world that had tried to murder us before we were even born. And somewhere in the darkness beyond these castle walls, the dangerous ones my daughter had identified were already plotting their next move. The royal chambers felt like a different world, silk curtains where there'd been rough wool, a bed large enough for 5 people replacing our narrow servant's cot, windows overlooking Highland Mountains instead of the muddy courtyard. Nancy pressed her face against the glass, enchanted, while I stood frozen in the doorway feeling like an imposter about to be discovered. For days had passed since the assembly. For days of navigating complex hierarchies I barely understood, of curtsying to wolves who'd ignored me last week when I'd scrubbed their chamber floors, of pretending I belonged in gowns that cost more than I'd earned in years. "You need to eat more than that," Robert said gently at breakfast, watching me push food around my plate. He treated me like fragile glass that might shatter, careful words, respectful distance, as though one wrong move would send me bolting back to the servants' quarters. Maybe he wasn't wrong. Every instinct Rose had drilled into me screamed that accepting protection was weakness, that self-reliance was survival, that trusting anyone with power was suicide. The pack members ranged from genuinely welcoming to coldly suspicious. Lady Brennan, an elderly wolf with kind eyes, had brought Nancy books about pack history. But Lord Ashford barely concealed his disdain when we passed in corridors, his lip curling at what he clearly considered contaminated bloodlines. Robert spread territorial maps across his study desk, pointing to markers representing neighboring alpha packs. "They're questioning the legitimacy of a half-blood heir," he admitted, his voice tight. "Some are waiting to see if this weakens our position. Others are simply curious about Nancy's abilities." "And the council members?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Confined to their estates under guard, but without concrete proof beyond Rose's letters and Nancy's observations." He trailed off, frustration evident. Their families are powerful. This requires careful handling. Nancy adapted faster than I did, already making friends with packed children, embracing her heritage with 7-year-old enthusiasm. She called Robert grandfather, naturally now, while the word stuck in my throat like something foreign. But during quiet dinners, Robert shared stories of Rose, her laugh, her stubborn compassion, her absolute refusal to let tradition override kindness. And I began seeing not the alpha king who terrified me, but the man who'd loved my mother enough to grieve for 26 years. She would have been proud of you, he said one evening, watching Nancy sleep curled in an armchair. Choosing differently than she did. That takes extraordinary courage. I thought of our servants' quarters, of invisibility and safety and endless running. Of everything we'd gained in 4 days, protection, community, belonging, and everything we now had to lose. Visibility came with a price I was only beginning to understand. The evening howl shattered the tentative peace we'd been building. A sound like nothing I'd ever heard, primal and terrifying, reverberating through stone walls until my bones vibrated with it. Nancy's eyes went wide with fear as Elena, head of the Royal Guard, swept into our chambers with lethal efficiency. Eastern boundary breach. Rogue wolves. Her scarred hand was already on her sword. Princess Nancy stays with me. Sarah, the Alpha King requires you in the strategy room immediately. I kissed Nancy's forehead, her small body trembling against mine. I'll be right back, sweetheart. Elena won't let anything happen to you. But Nancy gripped my sleeve with desperate fingers. Mama, it's like my dream. The bad one from last night. Grandmother Rose warned me. She said they'd come when everyone was looking the wrong way. Ice flooded my veins. Nancy had woken screaming before dawn, sobbing about a woman with my face telling her to watch the shadows while wolves chase ghosts. Robert's strategy room churned with controlled chaos. Warriors shouting reports, maps spread across tables, the scent of adrenaline sharp in the air. His eyes found mine across the crowd, and I watched comprehension dawn with sickening clarity. It's a distraction, he growled, already moving. God's damn it, it's a distraction. The shout came from the corridor outside. Sounds of struggle, a body hitting stone, then Elena's voice cutting through the confusion. Assassin intercepted. Royal Wing, 3rd floor. He was heading for the princess's chambers. We ran. Robert moved with supernatural speed, me struggling to keep pace in silk skirts never meant for running. The scene that greeted us turned my blood to ice. A wolf in servant's clothing pinned beneath 3 guards, a wickedly curved silver blade skittering across flagstones, its edge gleaming with something dark and viscous. Wolfsbane poison, Elena reported, her boot on the assassin's throat. Enough to kill an alpha, let alone a child. The wolf's eyes met mine with pure hatred before Robert's roar shook the corridor. Who sent you? Silence. Then Elena produced a sealed letter from the assassin's pocket, Lord Blackwell's personal sigil stamped in crimson wax. Found in his chambers an hour ago during the search, she said quietly. Detailed instructions. Timing coordinated with the Eastern breach. They wanted Nancy dead while you were distracted with territorial defense. Robert's hands shook with barely contained violence. They'll never get another chance, he said, his voice dropping to something lethal and absolute. Not to harm you. Not to touch Nancy. I swear it on everything I am. Nancy appeared in the doorway, Elena's protective hand on her shoulder, those golden eyes calm despite the chaos. Grandmother Rose told me Grandpa would keep us safe, she said with eerie certainty. She said you'd never fail us like you think you failed her. She said you learned. The corridor fell silent. My daughter speaking with the confidence of prophecy about a grandmother she'd never met, a woman 26 years dead who apparently visited her dreams with warnings that had just saved her life. Robert knelt before Nancy, his massive frame somehow gentle. Your grandmother was right. I did learn. His gaze lifted to mine, fierce and unwavering. They've shown their hand, made their move. Now it's our turn. I looked at the assassin bleeding on the floor, at the poisoned blade that would have stolen my daughter, while I stood in another room believing we were safe. At Elena's grim expression and Robert's barely controlled fury and Nancy's supernatural calm. We weren't just visible now. We were truly at war. Dawn broke cold and merciless over the great hall, gray light spilling through high windows onto hundreds of wolves summoned to witness packed justice. The 3 council members stood in silver chains that glinted like accusations, the metal weakening their supernatural nature until they looked almost human, diminished, vulnerable, stripped of the power they'd wielded for decades. Elena presented evidence with methodical precision, Rose's letters detailing the original conspiracy, bank records showing payments to rogue wolves, Lord Blackwell's own journal from 26 years ago documenting their plot with chilling clarity. Human blood contaminates the pure line, he'd written. The heir must not survive. Lord Blackwell's face twisted with unrepentant fury. You condemn us for protecting what our ancestors built. His voice carried across the hall, sharp with self-righteous conviction. For defending bloodline purity against human contamination? That woman, he spat the word toward me, and her mongrel child represent everything wrong with modern pack philosophy. Weakness disguised as compassion. Dilution masquerading as evolution. Murmurs rippled through the assembly, some agreeing, others growling disapproval. The pack divided, ancient prejudices colliding with changing ideals. I felt Robert tense beside me, preparing to respond, but my hand on his arm stopped him. This moment wasn't his to claim. It was mine. I walked deliberately toward the chained wolves, my borrowed courage steadying with each step across cold flagstones. Nancy's golden eyes tracked my movement, filled with trust that gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. You see weakness when you look at us, I said, my voice carrying to every corner. A human woman. A 7-year-old child. You're wrong. I stopped before Lord Blackwell, meeting his hatred without flinching. My mother survived 26 years hunted by wolves like you. Raised me alone, taught me to heal instead of harm, chose mercy over bitterness despite everything you stole from her. I've buried my husband, fled assassins through 3 provinces, walked into the one place I was taught to fear because my daughter needed me strong. And Nancy? I glanced at my daughter, her small frame wrapped in velvet, but her spine steel. She's 7 years old, and can already sense threats you couldn't hide with decades of practice. Conspiracies you thought buried deep enough to stay secret forever. I leaned closer, watching Lord Blackwell's eyes widen with something like fear. We're not weak. We're survivors. And that makes us infinitely more dangerous than any pureblood who's never fought for their existence, never had to become stronger than their circumstances, never learned that true power isn't domination but the refusal to be destroyed. The hall erupted. Howls of approval shook the ancient rafters, wolves throughout the assembly rising to their feet in thunderous support. The sound washed over me like absolution, like belonging, like finally stepping fully into light after 26 years of inherited shadows. Robert's voice cut through the chaos with alpha authority. The evidence is irrefutable. The crimes: attempted murder of my mate, conspiracy to assassinate my heir, coordinated attack on my granddaughter, demand blood justice. He paused, and I watched something soften in his expression. But Rose believed mercy was stronger than vengeance. That gentle hands topple. Fortress's force cannot breach. In her memory, I choose exile over execution. Lady Thornfield's perfect composure cracked. You'll regret this weakness, Robert. Showing mercy to humans has destroyed. One more word, Robert interrupted, his voice dropping to lethal quiet, and I'll reconsider my late mate's philosophy. My daughter has shown you more grace than you deserve. Test it again, and you'll discover exactly how far mercy extends. Guards led the 3 away in disgrace, their chains clinking against stone. The last I saw of Lord Blackwell, he was staring back at Nancy with something between hatred and fear. A 7-year-old child who'd unraveled his conspiracy with innocent observations, who carried power he'd tried to extinguish before she could draw breath. Robert's hand found mine as the hall slowly emptied, pack members approaching to offer formal recognition, to bow before their acknowledged princess, to welcome Nancy with gifts and protective promises. Your mother would be proud, he said quietly. You didn't just survive what they tried to do to you. You transformed it into strength that changes everything. I looked at Nancy, laughing with new friends, golden eyes bright with joy instead of fear. At Robert, whose grief had finally found purpose. At the pendant against my heart, Rose's rose, no longer a symbol of running, but of roots planted deep enough to bloom. We'd stopped hiding, stepped into light, claimed our place not through bloodline alone, but through the strength forged in survival, the power found in choosing mercy, the courage of refusing to become what fear demanded. And for the first time in my life, I understood what home truly meant. The evening sun painted the Highland Mountains in shades of copper and gold, the same colors as Nancy's laughter echoing across Blackmoor's courtyard. Rose's ceremonial gown, deep crimson silk preserved for 26 years, fit me as though my mother had known I'd one day need to wear it. The fabric whispered against my skin like a blessing, like permission to finally stop running. Nancy wore a crown of purple heather woven by pack children, her auburn braids adorned with wildflowers that matched the blooms scattered across the ancient stones. She looked every inch a Highland princess, joy radiating from her small frame in a way I'd never seen during our years of hiding. Robert had removed his ceremonial regalia, appearing simply as a grandfather watching his family with an expression of wonder, as though he couldn't quite believe we were real. The weight of decades seemed lifted from his shoulders, replaced by something lighter, warmer. Hope, perhaps, or the quiet contentment of wounds finally beginning to heal. Highland bonfires blazed against the twilight, their smoke carrying the scent of burning peat and roasting meat. Traditional music filled the air, drums and pipes creating rhythms that made even my human heart want to run with wolves. Some pack members shifted between forms with fluid grace, celebrating in fur and skin alike, their golden eyes reflecting firelight like scattered stars. Nancy was passed lovingly from wolf to wolf, each one teaching her fragments of clan history, ancient stories about the territories, phrases in the old language that predated human memory. She absorbed everything with fearless enthusiasm, repeating words that sounded like poetry, asking questions that made even the most reserved elders smile. Pack children swept her into traditional games I didn't understand but could appreciate. Elaborate hunts through the courtyard shadows, songs with complicated harmonies that required both human voices and wolf howls. Her laughter rang pure and unafraid, the sound of a child who'd finally stopped looking over her shoulder for dangers she couldn't name. "I never thought to hear that sound in these walls again," Robert said quietly beside me, his gaze fixed on Nancy as she raced past with a group of giggling children. Joy. Real, unguarded joy. It died with Rose. I thought it was buried forever. "She brought it back," I murmured, watching my daughter crowned in heather and firelight. "Your granddaughter brought light back to Blackmore. You both did." His hand found mine, warm and steady. "I spent 26 years drowning in guilt, convinced I'd failed the only person who mattered. Then you walked into my castle, terrified, protecting your daughter with everything you had, and gave me a second chance I never thought I deserved." My throat tightened with emotion. I spent my whole life believing survival meant invisibility, that safety required staying small and silent. You taught me that sometimes the bravest thing is standing in the light, trusting others to see you, and choosing not to run. Lady Brennan approached with a goblet of honeyed wine, her elderly face creased with genuine warmth. "To the princess who chose courage," she said, raising her cup, "and the child who brought prophecy back to our bloodlines." Other wolves joined the toast, their voices rising in traditional Highland blessing. Nancy ran to us, breathless and glowing, throwing her arms around Robert's legs with unself-conscious affection. "Grandfather, they're teaching me to howl properly." Her excitement was infectious, golden eyes flashing briefly before returning to brown. "And tomorrow, Elder McDougall said he'd show me the old pack archives, where all the history is kept. And," she paused, suddenly serious, "they're my family now, aren't they, Mama? Not just you and Grandfather. All of them." I knelt beside her, smoothing heather from her hair. "Yes, sweetheart. All of them. This is home now." The word felt foreign and right simultaneously. Home, not a temporary refuge or another place to flee from. Home, with community and protection, and belonging we'd never dared imagine during those years of desperate survival. Robert lifted Nancy onto his shoulders, her delighted shriek echoing across the courtyard. Wolves howled in response, a sound no longer terrifying but welcoming, celebratory, the voice of family acknowledging family. I watched them disappear into the celebration, my daughter and her grandfather, surrounded by pack members who'd sworn protection with genuine conviction. The silver rose pendant at my throat caught firelight, no longer heavy with loss but warm with promise. Rose had chosen to run, to hide, to protect me through isolation and fear. I'd chosen differently, to stand visible, to trust protection, to plant roots deep enough that no storm could tear us free. And in choosing courage over inherited fear, we'd found not just safety but genuine belonging. Not just survival but joy. Not just existence but home, finally and completely home. The bonfires burned bright against Highland darkness, and for the first time in 26 years, Blackmore Castle rang with laughter instead of grief. Robert led me back to the portrait gallery 3 weeks after the celebration, golden afternoon light streaming through leaded windows to illuminate the paintings I'd once discovered by accident. The corridor smelled of beeswax and autumn roses, deliberately chosen, I suspected, to mirror the scent clinging to everything in Blackmore. "There's something I want you to see," he said quietly, stopping before a canvas covered in crimson silk. My heart stuttered. Rose's portrait hung nearby, her painted eyes watching with serene wisdom, the silver rose pendant at her throat identical to the one warming against my skin. Robert pulled the covering away. The new painting stole my breath, Robert and Rose standing together in Highland twilight, his hand protective on her shoulder, her expression radiant with joy I'd never seen in any description of her. But it was the foreground that made tears blur my vision. Two small figures playing among wild roses, one with auburn braids and golden eyes, the other fair-haired and laughing, both unmistakably loved. A family, Robert's voice roughened with emotion. The one we were always meant to be. Just 26 years delayed. Young Sarah and Nancy, painted into a past that never happened, but somehow felt more real than the years of hiding and fear. A visual representation of what we'd lost and finally, impossibly, found again. I can give you every tomorrow, Robert said, turning to face me directly. Every protection, every moment I should have given your mother, but failed to provide. The pack needs you, Nancy needs you, but more than that, I need you. To heal what broke 26 years ago. To build the family Rose dreamed of before fear drove her away. His hand reached toward mine, trembling slightly. If you'll accept it. No obligation, no pressure. Just hope that you might choose to stay. I looked at Rose's painted face, at the woman who'd loved this man enough to bear his child, who'd fled rather than trust his protection, who'd spent 26 years teaching me that safety meant invisibility and trust meant vulnerability. But I also saw the breadcrumbs of truth she'd left scattered through my childhood. Stories about Highland castles, songs in the old language, the silver rose pendant she'd made me promise to always wear. As though some part of her knew that one day, when I was strong enough, those fragments would lead me home. She wanted this, I whispered, understanding flooding through me with sudden clarity. Rose didn't just run to protect me. She ran to give me time to become strong enough to survive what she couldn't. To prepare me for a return she knew might come. Robert's expression cracked with grief and gratitude tangled together. She gave you tools I never could have. Taught you survival, resilience, the strength to stand alone. And now I choose to stand beside you instead. I took his offered hand, feeling the rightness of the gesture settled deep in my bones. For Nancy. For the pack. For Rose's memory. For the future she sacrificed everything to make possible. His arms came around me in an embrace that felt like fortress walls and homecoming simultaneously. Safety and belonging, protection and family. Everything Rose had wanted but been too afraid to accept. Her sacrifice wasn't in vain. I sat against his shoulder, watching dust motes dance in afternoon light. Every year she gave me, every lesson she taught, every moment she kept me alive. It led to this. To us finally being ready for what she couldn't face alone. Nancy's voice echoed from somewhere down the corridor, calling for her grandfather with 7-year-old enthusiasm. Robert's laugh rumbled through his chest, the sound lighter than I'd ever heard it. Come find us in the gallery, little wolf, he called back, never releasing me. She appeared moments later, sliding to a stop before the new portrait, her golden eyes going wide with wonder. Is that us, grandfather? All of us together? That's us, he confirmed, pulling her into our embrace. Past, present, and future. A family 26 years in the making. I looked at Rose's portrait one final time, at the woman whose courage had been running rather than standing, whose love had meant distance rather than proximity, whose sacrifice had given her daughter the tools to make different choices. Thank you, I whispered to her painted face. For loving me enough to let me go. For being strong enough to survive alone. For leaving breadcrumbs that led me home when the time was right. The silver rose pendant caught light between us, no longer a symbol of loss, but of continuation, of healing, of transformation from fear into love, from isolation into belonging, from running into finally, gloriously standing still. We stood together in the gallery where everything had begun, surrounded by centuries of painted wolves and one woman who'd loved enough to flee, returning full circle to claim the family destiny had always intended us to be. The wolves howled throughout the territory that night, their voices rising from valley and mountain peak in ancient celebration, a chorus declaring acceptance and unity to the highland winds. Nancy joined them from the tower window, her 7-year-old howl pure and joyful, Robert's deeper voice harmonizing beside her with paternal pride. But beneath the symphony of wolf song, I heard something else, a voice I'd know anywhere, soft as memory and warm as summer. Rose's voice joining the chorus, finally at peace after 26 years of running, her burden lifted by the daughter who'd chosen courage where she'd chosen fear. Thank you for bringing them home, her whisper seemed to say, carried on autumn wind that smelled of peat and roses. Thank you for being stronger than I was. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, tears streaming freely. I couldn't have been strong without you, Mama. Everything you taught me, every year you kept me alive, that was the foundation I stood on when it was time to stop running. The wild rose metaphor she'd loved finally made complete sense. Beauty armed with thorns, appearing fragile yet resilient, capable of transforming barren soil into flourishing gardens. That was Rose's legacy. That was what she'd planted in me, roots deep enough to survive transplanting, strong enough to bloom in hostile ground. Nancy would grow up navigating both worlds with the ease Rose had never achieved. Human empathy inherited from generations of healers, wolf strength gifted by alpha bloodlines, the ability to bridge what others saw as unbridgeable divides. She'd carry Rose's compassionate healing and Robert's protective leadership, embodying a new paradigm neither world had imagined possible. Mama, look! Nancy pointed at the courtyard below where wolves gathered in both forms, celebrating around bonfires that painted everything copper and gold. They're all family now. Every single one. Yes, sweetheart. I gathered her close, breathing in heather and wood smoke. Every single one. Robert joined us at the window, his arms settling around my shoulders with comfortable certainty. The three of us framed in ancient stone that had witnessed centuries of pack history and would witness centuries more. The castle that once represented danger now meant sanctuary. The wolves I'd feared now formed protective circles around my daughter. The territory that rejected Rose had welcomed her granddaughter with open arms. We stood exactly where we belonged, I whispered, watching firelight dance across highland peaks. Finally, forever home. The howling continued, wolf song carrying across mountains and valleys, declaring to all who might hear that the lost princess had returned, that the prophecy child had arrived, that healing had come to Blackmoor after 26 years of grief. From hunted to honored, from hidden to home, from survival to thriving. Nancy's eyes flashed golden in the darkness, and somewhere in the wind, I swear I heard Rose laugh, the sound of a mother finally at rest, knowing her sacrifice had borne fruit beyond anything fear could have imagined. The silver rose pendant warmed against my heart, no longer remembering loss but celebrating legacy, no longer marking exile but proclaiming belonging. We were home, truly, completely, gloriously home, and the wild roses would bloom in Blackmoor's gardens for generations yet to come.